My name is Thomas Michael Richardson. On June 22, 2025, I was declared dead for 9 minutes on an ER gurney. What followed was a vision and a charge I cannot quiet. I am a husband, a deacon at Grace Fellowship, and a man who, until the morning I collapsed, thought his faith was at least serviceable. Before I go further, if you will stay with me to the end, I promise to tell you exactly what I saw and how I believe you should respond. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with 3 people who will pray with you. I want you to know where I came from, because that mattered the day I fell. Sarah and I have been married 15 years. Our oldest, Ethan, is 20. Our daughter Lily is 12 and likes to call me when she is nervous about tests. At church, I am a deacon. Books to balance, meals to deliver, a hand on the shoulder when someone cries. I have preached on faithfulness. I have prayed in hospital rooms. But in the year before June, I had drifted. Prayer was the first thing I traded for convenience. My Bible sat on the shelf beneath a stack of unpaid notices and ministry schedules. I was not someone living in secret sin or scandal. I was simply lukewarm. The shame of that small, steady distance from God weighs on me now more than the memory of the ambulance lights. That morning there was the ordinary smell of coffee in the kitchen, bitter and sharp, and sunlight staining the countertop. I remember the coffee cup warming my palms, then a pressure in my chest as if someone had put a heavy book on top of my ribs. It came suddenly, it came with a noise like wind through a thin door. Sarah later told me I told her I couldn't breathe, and then I slid down the kitchen cabinet, palms scraping the tile. She called 911, and her voice, tight, clear, told the dispatcher where we lived. I could hear the neighbor pounding on the door. I remember the stretcher's metal frame, the paramedic's glove smelling of antiseptic, and the tunnel of hospital lights as they rushed me through the bay. "We've lost him," one of the paramedics said, and the sentence landed like a finality. Machines went quiet. It is a strange thing to have the room condense into a pinpoint of sound and then become absolute silence. I am not a man who would invent such silence for effect. Later, the doctor told Sarah that my heart had stopped for 9 minutes. They called those 9 minutes clinical death. The staff spoke about probabilities and miracles in the same breath. I will not claim to understand the medical calculus. I can only tell you what happened while my pulse was not counted. What I saw was not a textbook description of heaven or hell, not a tidy signboard of doom. It was a tableau given to me in urgent, cinematic frames. At first there was darkness, but it was not empty. It bore the sound of a great threshold, like waves breaking on distant stone. The air had weight, as though laden with coal smoke. It smelled faintly of rain and something metallic, like the scent before lightning. Then light came, but not the easy, soft light I had known in my childhood prayer times. This was a focused, white gold light falling like columns through a heavy sky. In that light, I saw cities like plates under a storm, small, defined shapes. And I saw people, not as distinct faces so much as knots of light and shadow, some burning steady, some fluttering like candle flames in an open room. I was shown 3 things, clear as if a hand pointed at each in turn. First, I saw the structures that hold societies, government halls, courthouses, office towers, tremble. They were not struck down by armies in that vision. They were rattled by their own foundations loosening, leaders arguing as bridges in the image swayed. Voices that should have steadied only amplified fear. I was shown a ribbon of newspapers and screens cascading like a waterfall, headlines blurring into each other, people shouting into voids where leadership should have given counsel. I believe this to be a picture of governmental instability, not as prophecy of a single party or person, but of a season where institutions that once carried weight will fail to provide the assurance people seek. Second, there was a wide, low hum beneath the images of cities, a market that stalled. I saw conveyor belts slow, wallets close, and faces that had been steady grow strained. Not just numbers on a screen, but human mouths tightened against rising costs and the old safety nets fraying. I was shown scarcity in small human terms, an empty feed, a mother turning a shopping list over and over, more the ache of loss than a spectacle. Economic instability, the vision said, not absolute collapse, but a shaking that would ripple through homes and hearts, testing who trusts in bread and who trusts in the provider. Third, and most vivid, were the skies. The vision pressed me into thunderheads knitting themselves like fists across continents. Storms came like judgmental hands, sudden and sharpened. I saw seas rise in the imagery, coastlines changed by storms traveling inland. I saw towns buffeted by weather that had a new ferocity. Rain became a hammer in that frame. When the storms passed, I could see the people who had been praying, small lights gathered in ruined streets, bright against the dark, untouched like stars amid black glass. There was a sense of separation, like wheat being sifted. Those lights were not spared by the storm because they had pocketed some talisman. They stood steady because some other current held them, something like prayer and a surrendered heart. In the vision, I heard words that were not my own, but landed in my ears as if read from a page. I heard plainly, September will mark the beginning. The words came like a bell with a long toll, familiar in their gravity. I cannot tell you that I understood scope or timeline as the world will read it. I can only tell you what was shown to me. I will not harden that into doctrine for you. I say to you now, as I said then in the hospital haze, I was shown, and I believe God gave me that image and that date as a signpost of urgency. I am bringing that to you as testimony, not as the infallible map of the Almighty. When I returned, I cannot describe the transition. One moment the light was under my skin, the next my chest heaving like a bellows. The beeping in the room was louder than any sound I remember. Sarah was at my side, and Ethan and Lily later came in and crowded the foot of the bed like small guiltless armies. The oxygen mask cased of sterile plastic and a little of copper that followed adrenaline. The nurse's eyes were wet when she said, "You're back." Dr. Paul came in, pallid, and shook his head in a way that mixed relief and disbelief. Later, in the small hours when visits were fewer, I told Sarah what I had seen. Her hands were salt from worry. She listened and then prayed a short prayer, not for a sign, but for steadiness. "Lord, help us to live ready," she said, and I thought then how desperately I needed that help. I told Pastor Paul the next Sunday. He pressed his palm to my shoulder, an old preacher's gesture that steadied me more than it steadied him. He did not pronounce judgment or confirm a calendar. He asked me 3 pastoral questions. Did you meet the Lord? Did he commission you? And are you at peace with it? I said yes, yes, and no, because peace, for me, has been the work of these weeks. When I shared with the congregation, the response split into 3 familiar strains. Some came forward with tears, confessing small half-lives and wanting prayer. Others approached with thoughtful skepticism, offering practical counsel. Tell us what you saw, or could it be the brain's attempt to make sense of trauma? And I appreciated their steadiness. A few reacted with hostility, calling for evidence and warning against fear-mongering in our assembly. That division felt like a mirror of the vision itself, a sifting. Word traveled beyond our doors, which I had not expected. An older woman named Patricia wrote to me 3 days after I spoke. Her letter was hesitant at first, then plain. She said she had woken at 3:03 a.m. on the same night and seen storms gathering and a clock pointing to September in her dream. She did not ask for power or position. She asked for prayer. Small confirmations like that have multiplied. News of sharper storms on distant shores, markets wobbling, leaders making mistakes that reveal deeper fractures. And I do not attribute causality between my vision and those events. I only take them as nudges that we must not sleep. There is a pastoral line I have drawn for myself since that day. I do not prophesy with the arrogance of a man who thinks he can pin the Almighty to a date. I say plainly, I saw a vision. I was told a phrase. I am convinced of an urgency to return to foundational disciplines. My voice has two edges, one of warning and one of comfort. The warning calls out the complacency I saw in myself and will not reshape into condemnation for others. The comfort is simple. Those who truly seek the Lord will find shelter in His presence, not necessarily in a promise of exemption from difficulty, but in the peace that steadies the soul even while storms rage. You will hear, as I do when I teach now, 3 practical responses that matter more than bunker plans or fear-driven hoarding. First, return to prayer, not as duty, but as conversation that reorders the heart. Second, return to Scripture. Let it be daily bread that trains the soul, not occasional reading that comforts only when convenient. Third, reforge real discipleship. People who will meet together, confess sin, bear burdens, and not travel the urgent roads alone. These are not survival manuals for headlines. They are spiritual disciplines that make a people who can stand. A small prayer rose from me then, short and raw. Lord, give us courage. In that humble breath, I felt a steadying, as if the thread of the vision had been tied into the thread of my life, and I was called to stitch others into it, mindful and awake. I have spent these weeks knocking on doors among my brothers and sisters, testing whether the sparks of prayer in our church could become a fire of faithful readiness. Some responded, some did not. There is a weight to being believed that I did not expect. Some nights I lay awake and hear the questions. Did I misread the vision? Am I responsible if people act foolishly? These are reasonable fears, so let me be clear. I will not instruct you to flee, to hoard, or to take illegal or harmful action. The things I urge are measures of the soul. Pray, read, reconcile, forgive, reach out in love, be known by your neighbors. These are the ways the light I saw may shine. In the church meeting after I returned, a woman stood and asked aloud, "What about September?" Her voice was small, but the whole room leaned in. I answered in the way I must answer always, plainly and with the humility of a man who knows that his sight is limited. What I was shown names September as a marker, I said. I believe it is a sign to wake up, to examine hearts, to prepare spiritually. That night, the conversations did not end at the doors. They went home with people and woke late-night prayers and, inevitably, debate in coffee shops and online comment threads. The spread was not my doing. It was the seed of a vision and the care of those who heard. I do not want to leave you only with the image of a dark sky. There was another image in the vision that pressed on me with equal force. In towns ravaged by storm and in marketplaces quieted by fear, groups gathered in homes and parking lots, in living rooms and under trees, and they shone. The light around them was not the blinding blaze of spectacle. It was simple. Faces turned upward in prayer, hands joined, Bibles opened to familiar pages. Those lights were not spared because they were perfect. They were spared, it seemed, because they were honest and because they sought the face of the one who hears. I will tell you more of what I was shown and what this means for us as a community and as individuals. I will also tell you how the signs I saw are beginning to brush our days, and what practical, spiritual steps I believe move us toward being that light in storm. For now, hold with me this plain fact. I came back carrying a warning and a charge, and I am asking you, gently, urgently, to examine your heart and to examine your life. The air in the room changed that evening as people began to speak honestly. A man I did not know clasped my hand and said, "Tell me how to pray." A young mother wept quietly and said, "I don't know where to start." Those were the moments that felt like the other side of the vision, small human reactions to a cosmic word. I am not a prophet in court robes. I am a neighbor who, by God's mercy, was shown a scene and told to return. There is one more thing I must say before I continue. The vision did not leave me with despair, but with a strange iron hope. The same sky that darkened also held stars, little faithful lights, and I believe those lights were the answer. We cannot manufacture the light, but we can make our lives available to it. I will keep telling you what I was shown about a shaking of governments, markets, and weather. I will also share in plain pastoral language how to live now so that when September arrives, whether it comes as an accent to trouble or as a turning point, you will be steady in the things that matter. When I left the hospital, I found the world already humming with small reverberations. A headline here, an unusual storm bulletin there, a family friend saying their supermarket had empty shelves of a basic item. I am not saying these are the start of anything beyond normal fluctuation. I am only saying that they have sharpened my sense of urgency. I have also heard from people across town and a few from neighboring states who say they have had dreams or impressions with the same tone. Do not sleep. Be ready in your spirit. I want to tell you next how the vision pressed me to act inside the church, what meetings we held, how we began to organize prayer without panic, and how we sought to be a community that would hold each other. I also need to show you the pushback that came, the skeptical articles, the online ridicule, and how we navigated that without losing charity. There are details that matter, conversations with our pastor about public statements, the letter from Patricia and a man named Luis who offered to host small prayer groups, and the first concrete sign that made some people say, perhaps he did see something. But before I go further, I want you to place with me this central pivot. A vision does not save you. A vision can warn, it can move, it can awaken, but it is what you do with wakefulness that steadies a soul. If you are listening, ask yourself, what is one small thing you will change today to live as light? Put down the list, open your Bible, call a friend and ask for prayer. Do something that moves your heart closer to readiness. When I return to tell the rest of this story, I will describe the nights of prayer that began in my living room and overflowed into the church basement. I will tell of a storm that came close enough to bruise a coastline we know, and how a neighborhood banded together with blankets and casseroles. I will recount the moment when Pastor Paul stood before a congregation and said plainly, "We must be ready," and what followed in responses. For now, keep that question with you. Will you be the kind of light I saw standing in ruined streets? I will continue. We began in my living room with a handful of people, no more than 10 at first, sitting on mismatched chairs and the couch, Bibles open on laps, a thermos of coffee cooling on the end table. The first nights were halting and honest. We read short passages, someone would whisper a confession, another would ask how to pray for a particular fear. Patricia folded her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. Luis brought a simple trolley of bottled water and granola bars and set them by the door as if preparing for a journey. We sang softly, not because anyone expected to impress heaven with harmonies, but because singing steadied the breath and bound us together. Word spread in the measured way that small towns move, by phone calls and text messages, by a neighbor dropping a note at another neighbor's porch, by people who had come to services and remembered faces. Soon, the living room could not hold us. The church basement smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls the night we moved there, and we borrowed extra folding chairs from the school down the street. Someone arranged hymnals in neat stacks. Someone else taped a paper sign over the basement door, "Pray here, all are welcome." The sign looked like something from a different age, and that was part of what was happening. Ordinary gestures becoming sacramental. Pastor Paul did what pastors must do when a congregation's emotions and the town's curiosity begin to move in the same direction. He presided, he listened, he kept the tone sober. He would arrive early, remove his coat, and sit at the long cafeteria table that now served as the front of the room. He refused to make grand claims from the pulpit. Instead, he read scripture plainly, invited testimony, and kept asking practical questions. How are we feeding those who have no food? Who will check on the elderly? Who will make a list of households that need medicine? When he finally stood before the congregation on a Sunday morning and said simply, "We must be ready," his voice had the weight of someone who had counted the cost and understood what readiness meant, both for a storm and for a life reoriented toward God. Readiness in our context was not only storing the practical goods that became common in conversation, water, batteries, blankets, but also renewing relationships. We spent nights confessing hurts that had been allowed to fester, long silences replaced by apologies, grudges loosened by hearing one another's stories. People who had not spoken for years sat face to face and prayed for each other's healing. There was a theological clarity behind this. A house divided gives no shelter in a crisis. Practical preparedness and spiritual reconciliation walked together. We organized without panic. Luis and Patricia coordinated small groups on their block. One evening, 2 households took responsibility for checking on the elderly. Another group offered rides to appointments. Another kept a rotating chest of warm clothing and diapers. The church set up a simple spreadsheet, old-fashioned but effective, listing phone numbers, medications, and who had a generator. It was not because we trusted in the spreadsheet to save us. It was because we were tired of being idle if trouble came. We practiced calling one another in the middle of the night, just to make sure the lines worked and that no one hung up ashamed. Not everyone joined. Skepticism arrived like rain in a weather forecast, expected, necessary, often instructive. A local columnist wrote that the town was indulging in apocalyptic hobbyism. An online pundit mocked the basement meetings with a clip that looped the most earnest faces like a carnival exhibit. People I loved received a message that compared my experience to a stage trick. We felt those stabs, of course. Laughter can be a weapon as sharp as any. But we answered with hospitality. When a reporter came, Pastor Paul offered him a seat and a cup of coffee. When a mocking post went up, volunteers spent more time delivering soup than crafting rebuttals. Charity was not a tactic. It was the practice that kept us from combusting. Then came the storm that moved this from theory to a lived thing. The forecasts had predicted strong winds along the coastline. There were warnings and advisories and the standard litany of counsel. We watched the radar in kitchen windows and listened to the radio while folding blankets. The night it struck, the sky unreeled into a low sheet of cloud, and the wind arrived with a sound like a distant freight. Rain came in waves, and the ocean near our town heaved and reared as if offended. Streets that usually smelled of salt and diesel and summer barbecues filled with the tang of wet boards and overturned trash. Our part of town was not spared. Trees split like old rope. A garage door on Maple Street peeled away and lay like a dressing on the pavement. For a long hour there was worry about the levee by Harbor Road. But something odd, something people later described as strange but not miraculous, happened. The storm favored certain corridors of the town with particular fury and left others comparatively intact. Where the fury landed, it landed with a recklessness that made neighbors call each other in the middle of the night and the next morning emerge in sweaters with hands raw from clearing debris. Where the fury had not landed, where streets that met for prayer had been tidy nights before, there were downed branches but fewer broken windows, families intact, cars with minor dents rather than crumpled frames. That contrast was the first concrete sign that made some people say, almost involuntarily, perhaps he did see something. It started as gossip at first, a soft litany of, "Did you see?" and "I can't explain it." People compared maps and prayer lists, and patterns emerged. The neighborhoods that had organized into buddy systems, that had chosen to keep watch and make needs known, fared better not because of superstition, but because of simple reciprocity. A neighbor who had been praying with 2 others had also blocked water from a low basement with sandbags borrowed from the church, sandbags that had been delivered within hours because someone had a pickup and someone else had checked the list. The morning after the storm, the church basement became a triage of ordinary mercy. Coffee was hot, volunteers drove in with generators and portable heaters. I stood by the serving table as a woman I had seen at the first living room meeting carried in a stack of hand-knit hats. A young man from the youth group had cut his vacation short to help distribute warm food. There were tears, quiet ones, when a family who had lost a roof refused to spend the night in a motel and instead took space in the church parsonage because Pastor Paul insisted that nobody be on their own. That insistence, more than prophecy, convinced people. The other effect of the storm was how it exposed our weaknesses. We discovered homes with no insurance, prescriptions months behind, and social isolation so deep that some neighbors had no numbers to call. The vision had warned, it had not cured. The church's response had to shift from immediate relief to longer-term care. A list of needs became a plan: someone to help file claims, someone to sit with an elderly neighbor while they made phone calls, a rotating schedule to care for children whose parents had to deal with repairs. Those months were the invisible labor of faith. Volunteers who arrived without wanting praise, meals dropped on porches at midnight, work gloves passed from hand to hand. Not everyone who had mocked us recanted. There were still columns that framed our meetings as an excitable cult of fear. There were social media posts that suggested we were exploiting anxiety for membership growth. We took those as part of the cost of being visible. But there were also private notes, messages from people who had watched from the periphery and felt compelled to thank us, from men who admitted they had finally come in out of embarrassment and found a place to sit and to be seen. It is important to say plainly, none of this proves that visions are a reliable map for the future. A vision is a nudge, a wakefulness, a call to action. The storm tested what we did with that nudge. Some who heard the call and did nothing still weathered the storm fine. Some who worked hard and prepared still had difficult losses. The point was not a promise of invulnerability. The point was the discipline of being ready and the character formed in readiness. In the weeks that followed, our meetings deepened. We read sections of Scripture that spoke to endurance and mercy, selections from the Psalms that were honest about fear, the quiet insistence of the Beatitudes, stories of neighbors hosting one another in surprising seasons. There were nights we prayed for named people with specific needs, and days we sat down to balance practicality with spiritual counsel. We learned how to talk without inflating impressions into dogma. We learned to listen to people who had different fears and to walk beside them in the small, patient works of neighborliness. There were quieter moments too. I recall sitting in the back pew one evening after a service when a woman, someone who had never trusted religious speech, came and hugged me in a way that said more than any public testimony. "I don't know what to believe about the vision," she said into my shoulder, "but when they came to my house, they were the hands of something good." Such statements were the marrow of what we were doing. People needed hands more than certainties. A month after the storm, Patricia and Luis organized something unexpected, a neighborhood potluck in the park to both celebrate what had been salvaged and to inventory what remained fragile. Tables lined in a long row were covered in casseroles, some reheated, some still steaming, and the conversation roamed from laughter to strategy. Children chased each other with sticks that were still damp from rain. We passed around printed lists of people who needed help that week and signed names without fanfare. That day, a woman asked me quietly, "Do you still have your vision?" I told her the truth. I have the memory of it, and I have a sense to keep watching, but what I rely on is what we do together. There was a larger consequence too. Neighboring towns had watched our response, some with curiosity, some with skepticism, and a few called to ask how we had organized. Pastor Paul began, reluctantly at first, to preach short, practical sermons on stewardship, generosity, and reconciliation. His sermons did not proselytize fear. They taught the small disciplines of community life. When the next severe weather advisory came months later, there was less anxiety and more muscle memory. People who had hosted in the past knew the names of those who needed shelter. Lists were updated. Someone had prepaid for a motel room should the worst happen. Through all this, my own conviction matured. The vision had been a doorway into the real work of being a neighbor. I began to measure my faith less by the scale of my revelations and more by the steadiness of my hands. I found that readiness is rarely glamorous. It is remembering to call a lonely friend, sitting with someone who cries, splitting a casserole into 2 dishes, budgeting a little more faithfully, forgiving a debt of slowness in another's life. These are small things, and together they bend a life toward the light. There remain things I have not yet told you. About the conversation Pastor Paul had with a city official. About Patricia's late-night letter that sparked a wave of small groups across town. About the call I received from someone 2 counties over who shared a dream that echoed my own. There are stories of grief and of redemption in unexpected places. I will tell those, and I will tell you how we began to imagine our readiness as more than a local habit, a posture toward a world that often seems brittle. For now, I want you to hold the simple, stubborn truth that animated those nights in the basement and the potlucks in the park. When people gather honestly, when they exchange bread and names and lists, when they do the small things with disciplined love, a town becomes more livable and souls become steadier. That is the practical theology we need in anxious times. That is how a vision, which by itself saves nothing, can yet press a community into the work that shapes survival into mercy. I will continue. Pastor Paul's conversation with the city official happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the church office, with rain freckling the window and a half-drunk mug of coffee cooling between them. He had gone to speak as one neighbor to another, not to demand resources, but to report what ordinary people were already doing. He described the lists, the motel prepayment plan, the spare keys held by neighbors, the way people were learning each other's rhythms. The official listened, not as an abstract administrator, but as someone who, like many of us, had grown tired of the hazard notices and wanted to see what actually worked. What followed was small and bureaucratic, and, in its smallness, useful. A loose agreement that the town would allow the use of certain municipal spaces as vetted shelters during emergencies, an expedited line for donating city-owned cots, and a modest discretionary fund to backstop motel vouchers in cases where crowding made home hosting impossible. None of it solved systemic neglect. None of it felt heroic.
But it created a seam, the kind of seam that lets people stitch safety into a place where it had been torn. Patricia's late-night letter began as a single page spilled across a table, ink shaky from sleep, full of questions and the kind of blunt tenderness that people in long marriages develop. She wrote about how the work in the basement had taught her to start small. Bring coffee, sit without rushing, name the things that scare you without trying to fix them. She asked whether groups could meet not to prepare plans, but to practice being steady with one another. That letter became a pattern. Seed letters forwarded by hand, then email, then a hastily printed flyer taped to the library board. Before long, there were groups in living rooms and at the senior center. People who gathered to share a casserole and to rehearse how they would call out for help, how they would accept help without humiliation, how they would listen when someone needed to tell the same story again and again. The call from 2 counties over came on a bright morning when the phone line at the church was slow with someone asking about food boxes. A woman with a voice like late summer asked if I could tell her about the dream I'd had. She confessed that she had dreamed of a town passing bowls between houses like a relay. She wanted to know if our gatherings were a model. The conversation was quick and intense. Names exchanged, calendars compared, and later a visit arranged. That visit altered both communities. They watched us and we watched them, borrowing practices and shedding pretensions. It became clear that readiness is not a curriculum you deliver. It is a set of habits you cultivate in flesh and blood ways. There was also grief. A house on Willow Street that had been one family's home for 4 generations took the worst of the next season's rivercrest. We formed a chain to salvage what we could. Photographs pressed into plastic, a child's blanket wrapped around a kitchenette chair. The owner, an old woman named Mabel, sat on the curb and let people fold her life into boxes. She kept saying, "I thought we were careful." And we kept saying nothing doctrinal, only gestures, a hand on a shoulder, the offer of a warm place to sleep. In the hours and days that followed, the small muscles of the community flexed. Someone fixed a roof. Another trimmed mold from a floorboard. Someone else tracked down a cousin who could make a bed. Mabel's grief did not resolve into a tidy sermon. It was met with peeling paint, meals, and the slow work of rebuilding. Those occasions revealed in luminous ways what the vision had intended and what it had not. The vision had been a prod, an incitement to attention, but what mattered most was the disciplined practice of ordinary mercy. We learned painfully that miracles in our town rarely arrived as overnight reversals.
They came as steady hands carrying buckets, as people showing up repetitively for months, as the willingness to keep signing one's name on a list. There were also strange moments of grace. An estranged son, whom many thought had abandoned his aging father, turned up with a truck and a look of a man who had learned to hold shame thinly. The father did not make a public reconciliation. He accepted the help with a grunt and a cup of tea. For both of them, the larger arc of reconciliation was not a dramatic unburdening, but a sequence of small apologies and physical presence. Other threads were darker. An argument over distribution of donated goods that cut friendships. A woman who refused help because accepting it would mean acknowledging a past she had vowed to forget. Those fractures taught us humility, that good intentions do not erase complexity, and that systems of neighborliness must be tempered by patience and by a willingness to sit in the awkward. Over the months, our small practices took on a certain architecture. Lists turned into coordinators. Coordinators learned to rotate tasks so no single person burned out. We rehearsed non-urgent calls, the kind that keep someone from sliding into isolation. We mapped who could take in a pet, who could boil water for a week, who had room for a small mattress. We practiced saying, "I can come at 9," and then coming at 9. Those little promises, kept, became our covenant. My own measure of faith shifted. The early hunger in me for sign and spectacle cooled into a hunger for steadiness. I still had dreams, fragments that fluttered through sleep, but they no longer carried the determinative power they once seemed to have. Instead, they became invitations to ask a practical question: what do we do when the phone rings at midnight? The answer required not revelation, but organization. Not charisma, but rotas. It required small acts repeated until they became habit. There remains, of course, the matter of scale. Preparing casserole dishes and rotating volunteers is not the same thing as remaking economic structures or rewriting policies that leave certain neighborhoods vulnerable. Yet those smaller things have a way of making a town more human in the spaces between formal systems. They do not replace advocacy, they make it more urgent and more credible. When people who had been gently practicing neighborliness showed up at a council meeting, their testimony carried a different weight. They knew names, they showed lists, they offered practical solutions born of experience rather than theory. And so we kept going. There were trainings, unshowy, practical sessions about how to manage donated goods, how to screen offers of help so that dignity would be preserved, how to create confidential lists for elders who preferred their needs to remain private. There were more potlucks. There were nights of grief and nights of laughter so fierce we all had to step outside for air. We learned that readiness lives not in a flashing alarm, but in the daily decisions that make shelter possible before the storm comes. I will tell you next about the winter the power failed for 3 days and how a church hall became an arena of improvisation, about the woman who stitched blankets in the dark and the teenager who led a small, rickety choir. There are names and moments that deserve to be recorded in their specificity. For now, hold this. What sustains a fragile place is not a single salvation, but the slow accretion of small, steadfast mercies. That is the work we accepted, that is the work that kept us learning, and that is the work that, in time, taught many of us how to be neighbors in a way that actually mattered.